Good morning, teachers. Today we're going to talk about the first lesson of Unit 6 in AP Macroeconomics, which is going to talk a little bit about kind of an introduction to countercyclical policy. So what we're going to focus on today is 4 essential questions with regards to countercyclical policy. All of this stuff is the intro basic stuff. So in this lesson, we're going to attempt to talk briefly about what is countercyclical policy. This is going to be a little bit of review of things the students have theoretically already learned at this point. Alongside that, we're going to also talk about why we engage in countercyclical policy. Then we're going to go through the how, so this is going to be a lot of review of the previous 2 units. What are the specific tools and the specific policies that make up countercyclical policy? We'll figure out how do we go about engaging in this type of policy. And last but not least, we're going to introduce the concept, though not fully explain, what exactly does countercyclical policy do. So we'll kind of give the 2-cent explanation of it in this video, and then the follow-up videos should go into that in a lot more detail. So if you are interested in learning about countercyclical policy, this is going to be the video for you, so let's go ahead and get started. So on this slide, we're going to attempt to answer the first 2 of the essential questions at the same time. So here we're going to answer the big questions: what is it and why do we do it with regards to countercyclical policy? So the first one is actually fairly simple, and hopefully the students understand and remember this from the beginning of the course. But we know that we are having countercyclical policy, meaning we're going against a cycle. And in this case, countercyclical policy is designed to counteract the effects of the business cycle. You'll probably want to do a brief review because it's been a while since we talked about the business cycle in this class. But do a brief review with the kids and make sure they remember that the business cycle is essentially the ebb and flow of any market economy, where we'll go through recessions and troughs and then recoveries and then peaks, and then the process will repeat itself over and over and over again. What we're interested for the purposes of the business cycle here is not really in changing the business cycle. We've never been able to prevent recessions long term. Like, one will always be coming no matter what. We can't have, a period of, 40 years worth of recovery, even however nice that might be. But when we're talking about the business cycle when it comes to countercyclical policy, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the business cycle out of its habit of what we call the boom and bust cycle. So, with no policy action, if you just leave economies to their own devices, we'll naturally see periods of really rapid expansion. So things start to get good, everybody starts spending money, GDP skyrockets, the unemployment rate drops down really, really low to full employment. And then we'll see those really rapid, quick periods of expansion followed by very rapid periods of contraction. And this boom and bust cycle, where things get really, really, really good for a couple of years, then the whole economy collapses and we have to start building from scratch, is actually quite bad. And this boom and bust cycle is what countercyclical policy is designed to counteract. So we don't like to have the boom and bust cycle because the boom and bust cycle leads to unpredictability in the markets, right? I might have a good job today, but if we are constantly, every 5 or 10 years, the economy completely collapses, I don't know whether I'm going to have that job in the future. And this is bad for both individuals and it's bad for businesses. It's bad for individual consumers because it prevents me from being able to make rational consumption choices because I don't have the ability to predict far out into the future, right? I might put off going out and taking out a mortgage in order to buy a home if I think in a couple of years it's possible the economy will collapse, I'll lose my job, and won't be able to find another one. So the boom and bust cycle is bad for consumers. It actually discourages consumption, especially long-term consumption, because it's unpredictable. And it's also equally bad for very much the same reasons for businesses. Not only is it bad for businesses because it discourages consumption from those consumers where the businesses make their money from, but it also prevents something that's very important to long-term economic growth, and that's investment. If I'm a business, I don't want to put out, a multi-year investment that's going to be costing me, millions of dollars a year if I'm not 100% sure that the economy is going to be in a good place when that investment is finished. So businesses who are in these boom and bust cycles tend to be nervous, and when they're nervous, they don't make long-term investments, or at least not as many long-term investments as we would like, because the market's unpredictable. So businesses thrive in predictable environments, and the boom and bust cycle itself is inherently unpredictable. It is bad for consumers, it is bad for producers, it's pretty much bad for everybody. So we're going to engage in some countercyclical policy to try and moderate the effects of the boom and bust cycle. So in our second example, we see here my kind of crudely drawn interpretation of what the business cycle looks like when we're engaging in good counter-cyclical policy. So what you'll notice is the highs are less high on this business cycle, but the lows are less low. And that's essentially what countercyclical policy is attempting to do. We basically lop off the tops and lop off the bottoms of the boom and bust cycle. And what we're left with are bumps in the road, but not major meltdowns. So we may have, recoveries and recessions, but they're not double-digit growth recoveries followed by double-digit contraction recessions. And they're relatively moderate in the grand scheme of things. Why do we want to do this? A couple of reasons. You may not be able to tell exactly from my drawing here, but good countercyclical policy can actually shorten recessions and lengthen recoveries, meaning that although the business cycle always follows the same exact path, there's no rule that says there has to be 6 months of recession for every 6 months of recovery. And we're learning that lesson right now. So we're at the tail end of almost a decade-long recovery right now. And so there's no rule that says that the next 10 years will have to be a recession. Provided we engage in good countercyclical policy, you can have long recoveries followed by short recessions, which makes everybody happy. In addition to that, it moderates growth. It'll prevent us from having that double-digit growth that we saw in the Industrial Revolution, but it also prevents us from having those economic crashes that we saw, like in the 1920s or, to some degree in 2008 as well. And so by overall moderating and softening the business cycle, good countercyclical policy makes it to where the business cycle are more bumps in the road than they are complete collapses of the economy. And this is really, really good for both consumers and producers. If I'm a consumer, I know that, even if we go into a recession next year, it's not going to be the Great Depression. I'm not going to, have to sell my house and make soup out of my shoes. It might be, temporarily painful for a lot of workers in the short term, but we're going to get out of it. It's not the end of the world the way that previous depressions and recessions had been. So I'm able to make long-term decisions about my consumption, buying houses, buying cars, with some level of certainty that I'm going to be financially okay at the end of those loans, as I am right now when I'm taking them out. Good for businesses as well. If I'm a business and I want to invest in a factory and it's going to cost me, $100 million and take 5 years to build, I'm willing to engage in that if I can be relatively certain that the economy is going to be in roughly the same shape when that investment is finished as it is today. So moderate, slow, steady growth over a long period of time, that's what we're aiming for with the business cycle. It's good for consumers, it's good for producers, it encourages investment today, and as we learned in aggregate supply demand, investment today leads to long-term growth tomorrow. So, countercyclical policy designed to basically moderate the business cycle, counteract the effects of the boom and bust cycle. It's good for pretty much everybody. Let's go on to how do we go about engaging in countercyclical policy. So there are essentially three different ways that we go about making countercyclical policy. And all three of these should at least be somewhat familiar to the students at this point. None of these should be brand new to them at this junction in the course. But you're going to want to go back over all these kind of from scratch, maybe a little faster than you did the first time, but you'll need to go back over them from scratch because especially for fiscal policy, it's been maybe a month and a half since the kids were exposed to fiscal policy, and they may have forgotten. It's one of the more heavily tested things on the AP exam, so you'll definitely want to spend a little bit of time going back over this. I usually spend an entire class period on this lesson that we're doing, and a majority of that time is spent on this, which is basically a review of automatic stabilizers, discretionary fiscal policy, and discretionary monetary policy. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going into each of these, but before I do, I want to give a brief shout out in case there's any monetarists in the audience today, that not everybody necessarily agrees, outside of the classroom anyway, necessarily agrees that we should engage in discretionary monetary policy. But for the purposes of this course, which is an Intro to Macroeconomics course, we're going to make the presumption that discretionary monetary policy is something that we should do in a countercyclical sense. I just wanted to point out that not everybody necessarily agrees with that statement, but for the purposes of this course, we're going to assume that it's good. The first big piece of policy that makes up countercyclical policy are what we call automatic stabilizers, or what some textbooks call built-in stabilizers. These are essentially kind of minor policy tweaks that we've created that will automatically start creating countercyclical policy without necessarily requiring congressional action or without anybody even necessarily noticing. Now, there's a lot of different programs that make up our automatic stabilizers, but the two ones we tend to focus on in this class are our progressive method of taxation, which is that income taxes, personal income taxes, go up when income goes up, and our social safety net, which causes government transfers to basically be inversely related to income. So people who make less money get more government transfers. When people make more money, they get less government transfers. These two automatic stabilizers begin to create countercyclical policy. Now, they're not enough on their own to counteract the business cycle, but they get us started on the right foot when recessions and recoveries start to happen. So what we'll see automatic stabilizers do is that when there's a recovery going on and we're starting to see inflationary pressure, what we see is that people's wages go up. And when people's wages go up during those recoveries, we see increases in people's level of taxation because of that progressive tax rate. So if I make more money this year than I made last year, my taxes go up. And we tend to see the level of government transfer payments go down when people's incomes go up. So when people's incomes increase, they stop receiving social safety net programs like food stamps or TANF or any number of these other programs. So combined, these things tend to see the level of taxation rise and the level of government spending on the social safety net fall when recoveries happen due to changes in people's income. And this happens automatically. Congress doesn't have to do anything. Nobody even has to notice that people's incomes are going up. The moment those incomes go up during a recovery, the social safety net spending falls and taxes go up on them. In addition to that, we'll see the opposite happen when we go into recession. When people go into recession, they'll lose their jobs. They'll be bringing in less money than they did before. We tend to see the level of government revenue fall, so people's taxes fall when they earn less money. And if they're losing their jobs and they're not earning as much, they're going to start to qualify for lots of social safety net programs like unemployment insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll see the level of government spending on the social safety net automatically go up when a recession hits as more people make less money and qualify for those programs that they didn't qualify for before. So taken as a whole, automatic stabilizers are designed. They're just basically policies that are designed as kind of an economic tripwire. When incomes start to rise, they automatically raise taxes, they automatically reduce spending on the social safety net, and when incomes fall, they automatically lower taxes and automatically increase spending on the social safety net, both of which are the types of policies we'd want to see in order to have a stable economy. The next and by far largest piece of the countercyclical policy pie is going to go to discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy is made by Congress working together with the President through the creation of the budget and the budgetary process. So essentially, discretionary fiscal policy basically does for the economy the exact same things that the automatic stabilizers did, but on a much larger scale. So Congress has control over trillions of dollars of government spending and trillions of dollars of government revenue every single year. And so through the budgetary process and determining tax rates and determining the level of government spending, Congress can have a much bigger impact on the economy than just automatic stabilizers alone. So once Congress notices there's a problem in the economy, be that problem unemployment during a recession or inflation during a recovery, they can then engage in this discretionary fiscal policy to kind of pile on top of the policy being created by those automatic stabilizers to get the economy back on track. So Congress has the ability through discretionary policy to really alter the course of the business cycle, whereas the automatic stabilizers are more of a nudge. Congress can actually flat out alter course here if they choose to engage in this discretionary form of policy. Discretionary, of course, meaning they have control over it. So, discretionary fiscal policy is all about changing the budget through changes in the level of taxation and changes in the level of government spending. So in the event that there's a recession, the correct discretionary fiscal policy is to engage in what we call expansionary fiscal policy, which is a reduction in personal tax rates and an increase in government spending. Now, if you could do some basic math, if you lower taxes, so you're lowering government revenue, and increase government spending, this expansionary policy creates budget deficits. And so what this essentially means is that the government is putting in more money into the economy in the form of spending than it's taking out in the form of taxes. And so what we'll see is a net gain to the economy when we engage in budget deficits, which we run anytime we're having expansionary fiscal policy. On the other end of things, and a little bit less common, let's say the economy is growing a little bit too rapidly and we're starting to see inflation. Congress can, if they want to, engage in contractionary fiscal policy to kind of pump the brakes on the growth in the economy. They would do this through increasing tax rates and decreasing government spending. And you don't have to be a political scientist to understand that increasing people's taxes while cutting their programs tends to make people a little bit irritated. But if Congress chose to engage in this contractionary policy, they would create budget surpluses. So government would be spending less and bringing in more. And that's one of the ways that you combat inflation. So contractionary policy represents the government pulling more money out of the economy through taxation than they're putting back in through government spending. And that will slow growth and hopefully reduce the inflation rate. Keeping in mind that because we engage in what's called the political economy, contractionary policy tends to be relatively uncommon from Congress because, as I said, the voter tends to not like it when you raise their taxes and cut their programs at the same time. And so oftentimes congressmen who engage in contractionary policy tend to get punished at the ballot box in future elections. So Congress is very hesitant to engage in contractionary policy, but they're always gung-ho for expansionary policy because people love expansionary policy. That's what's called the political economy. Last but certainly not least, we have discretionary monetary policy, which is the countercyclical policy that's made by the Federal Reserve, specifically the Fed's Open Market Committee. What you'll see here is essentially an attempt to back up discretionary fiscal policy, but through slightly different means. So whereas fiscal policy deals with the budget and budget deficits and budget surpluses, discretionary monetary policy attempts to move the economy through changes in interest rates. We'll get back to this in a second, but just remember that interest rates are one of the determinants of investment spending. And so really, when the Fed engages in monetary policy, they're nudging interest rates in an attempt to affect investment spending coming from businesses. So they're attempting to affect aggregate demand by affecting that IG variable, or gross private domestic investment. Just like fiscal policy, there are two flavors of monetary policy, but rather than expansionary and contractionary like we had in fiscal policy, we have easy money, which is just expansionary, and tight money, which is just contractionary. And they do effectively the same thing as expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. So easy money policy is designed to lower interest rates to create additional investment spending coming from businesses. Businesses like to borrow and invest when interest rates are low. And so what we'll see the Fed do in order to accomplish that is one of three things. They'll either lower the discount rate, which is the rate the Fed charges banks to lend them money. If they lower the discount rate, banks will borrow more money, which means there's more money available to loan, which drives down interest rates. Discretionary monetary policy also can cause the Fed to lower the reserve requirement. This is something that they don't usually do. Kind of changing reserve requirements is a motion of last resort for the Fed because banks don't like it when you adjust the reserve requirement without telling them. But if worse things happened and push came to shove, they certainly could. Lowering the reserve requirement would require that banks have less money in reserve, which would allow them to have more money to lend, which would also reduce interest rates. And most commonly, the number one thing that the Fed will do, and also the number one thing the AP exam asks about, are what we call open market operations. And open market operations are when the Fed goes into the bond market specifically and buys and sells predominantly U.S. Treasury bonds on the open market. So should the Fed go to the open market to buy bonds, the Fed would be bringing in bonds and giving those bondholders cash, which would mean there's more money in circulation, which would lower interest rates. So your three easy money policies designed to stimulate the economy are lowering the discount rate, lowering the reserve requirement, and buying bonds on the open market. All of these things will have the same effects, though to a lesser degree, as expansionary fiscal policy. We'll get to that in the next slide. Should the Fed want to pump the brakes on the economy, they can engage in tight money policy, which is designed to increase interest rates. And they would basically just do the opposite of easy money policy here. They could increase the discount rate, making borrowing more expensive. They could increase the reserve requirement, making it so that banks have less money that they're able to lend out, or they can sell bonds on the open market. If they sell bonds, they end up bringing in cash and taking that cash out of circulation in exchange for those bonds. And when that cash leaves circulation, that'll have the effect of increasing interest rates. So these three things together are essentially countercyclical policy, and it's all three of these things moving at the same time and hopefully in the same direction is how we prevent the boom and bust cycle. Our final question is, what does countercyclical policy do to the macroeconomy? So let's start off by just looking at fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers, as fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers have the same effect on the economy. Long story short, fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers changed the level of government spending and changed the level of taxation. And by changing taxation, they can alter consumer spending. Consumers spend less money when their taxes go up and more money when their taxes go down. So because our aggregate demand determinants were consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports, fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers essentially attempt to adjust aggregate demand by changing the variable C through changes in taxation and changing the variable G through changes in government spending. So the budgetary process basically affects consumer spending and government spending at the same time. And by altering both of these, we can shift aggregate demand in the direction that we want. So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, if we start off with our economy in a recession, where our level of our GDP is below our long-term potential, we can increase aggregate demand to get back to long-run aggregate supply through reductions in the tax rate and increases in government spending. So those will create positive demand shocks here. On the other side, if we're in a really good recovery and we start to see high levels of inflation, we can slow down the economy to get back to full employment to prevent that hyperinflation through increases in the tax rates and decreases in government spending. And this will cause a negative demand shock. Aggregate demand will shift to the left. So essentially, fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers control the economy by doing one thing and one thing only, and the thing that they do is adjust aggregate demand. The way that they go about adjusting aggregate demand is by changing consumer spending behavior and government spending behavior. All right, teachers, the last thing that we need to work on is taking a look at how monetary policy affects the macroeconomy. Long story short, the monetary policy affects aggregate demand in very much the same way that fiscal policy does. The only difference is that monetary policy coming from the Fed is going to impact aggregate demand indirectly, whereas our fiscal policy was able to impact it directly. So what we're going to see here is we're going to do an example. We're going to walk through the process of impacting aggregate demand through easy money policy or expansionary monetary policy. And what you're going to see drawn here first off is the two monetary policy graphs, the money market and the market for loanable funds. And what you'll notice is when we engage in easy money policy, we're going to see an increase in the money supply on the money market and an increase in the supply of loanable funds on the market for loanable funds. The impact of these two changes is going to be a reduction in both nominal and real interest rates, and that's really where monetary policy is coming from. So basically everything monetary policy does is geared toward impacting interest rates, because those interest rates are going to be the tool that the Fed uses to impact aggregate demand. So if we have nominal rates and real interest rates falling due to increases in the money supply and increases in the supply of loanable funds, this is going to result in lower interest rates, which is going to result in an increase in investment spending, keeping in mind that investment spending and interest rates have an inverse relationship with each other. So because investment spending is one of the determinants of aggregate demand, an increase in investment spending is going to cause a positive demand shock, aka a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. And if we were in a recession to begin with, as we are at equilibrium point 1, proper use of easy money policy, increasing the money supply, lowering interest rates, can actually get us back out of that recession, as evidenced by equilibrium point 2. So I'm not going to walk through the tight money policy with you because this is a really long video already, but essentially tight money policy, just invert all of the arrows on this slide, and that's tight money policy. It shrinks the money supply, raises interest rates, and reduces aggregate demand. So hopefully you found our introduction to countercyclical policy useful. Let me know if you've got any questions. You know how to reach me. Thank you.